Hamen. Safe and victorious, Karl the Great, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, had returned from Hungary. He had conquered the wild Avars, destroyed their strongholds, and come back to Paris with much booty. High festival was being held in the royal palace, for the king was busied dividing the newly conquered country into counties and baronies amongst those of his warriors whom he thought best fitted for such responsible charge. While thus employed, Lord Hugh of Dordogne came forward and asked the king if he had forgotten the faithful services rendered him by Count Hamen of Dordogne, that he had not mentioned his appointment to any of the new fiefs. Karl at once replied that he had not forgotten Hamen, but he considered that bold warrior had already fiefs enough and to spare. Indeed, if he gave him more, it would only make him think himself as powerful as his master, and might even tempt him to throw off his allegiance to the Frankish crown.
"He is a faithful vassal, sire," answered Hugh, "as true as a sword to its sheath. But if he is given a lower position than meaner men, he may in good truth forget his oath of allegiance, and fight for his rights. Did he do so, he would not lack aid from many a trusty comrade."
As he spoke, the hero touched his sword significantly. The king's wrath was so roused by the boldness of this speech that he drew his sword, and next moment the good lord's head was severed from his body at one blow. The courtiers drew back in speechless horror, and Hamen, who came in at that instant, asked one of the bystanders what had happened. When he heard the reason of the king's murderous deed, he turned sharp round upon his heel, and went out without further word or greeting. As soon as he reached his own castle, he gathered his friends about him, and declared war against his liege lord. No great battle was fought, but continual conflict raged between the contending parties. The country was laid waste, and the peasantry suffered terribly. Hamen was able to move about from place to place with such incredible swiftness that people began to say he rode a magic horse, gifted with the speed of lightning and the wit of man. The war lasted for years, till at last King Karl came with a large army and besieged the castle of the rebel count. One morning, when matters were in this position, Hamen went to the stables as usual with a feed of oats for his favourite horse, but the stall was empty. The good steed Bayard was gone. Hamen was in despair. He was just considering whether it was worthwhile carrying on such a hopeless war, when his cousin Malagis, a small, insignificant-looking man with a long beard, came to him, and told him that he knew for certain that the devil had carried off the horse, and had hidden it in Mount Volcano, which is near the mouth of hell. He further promised to go and fetch it in spite of all difficulties. Then, without waiting for a word of thanks or warning, the little man turned and left the count. When he got outside the castle gate, Malagis pulled a small bag of powdered hellebore from his pocket. He sprinkled a good deal of it in the air, and the wind carried it over the besiegers' camp. A general fit of sneezing suddenly infected the whole army. While the men-at-arms were thus sneezing and calling out "God bless you" to each other, Malagis quietly walked through their lines and pursued his journey to Mount Volcano. He reached the foot of the great mountain in safety, and saw smoke and flames issuing from its top. He at once went in search of the ruler of the world of fire, greeted him courteously, and introduced himself as a great necromancer who had come to offer his valuable services to his satanic majesty. The devil answered sarcastically that he was accustomed to hear the followers of the black art vaunt their powers and wisdom, but, as he was curious to see what the stranger could really do, he would give him a chance of showing off. "You must know, fellow," he continued, "that I have always hitherto ridden on the storm wind, but I find that too great an exertion now. I am grown too old for that sort of thing. So I looked out for a good horse and managed to find one fleet enough to satisfy me. I therefore took possession of it and brought it here. I thought that I should now be able to ride through the world of men more at my ease than before, but—" and here he sighed deeply, and blue flames issued from his mouth as he did so. "If I were not the devil myself, I should say that that horse was an incarnation of Satan. He will not even let me mount him. I have therefore put him into the volcano, hoping to tame him in that manner,
I have kept awake for months to look after this work myself, but hitherto without effect. Will you take my place while I enjoy a little nap?"
"Well spoken, great king," said Malagis, "but should I not be able to watch the effect on the horse better if I were close to it? Let me therefore beg you to withdraw the fire and smoke for a few minutes, that I may go down into the heart of the mountain and enter upon my duty. Perhaps also the horse may be more easily induced to obey if he gets a breath of fresh air." Satan consented to do as he was asked. He climbed to the top of the mountain accompanied by Malagis, and ordered the spirits of the netherworld to hold back the flames. As soon as the intense heat had cooled down, the necromancer descended into the abyss and took up his position near the horse. Then, as if by accident, he threw what looked like a handful of ashes up in the air. But it was really a sleeping powder. In another moment, the Prince of Hell was sound asleep, and snoring so loud that the mountain trembled at the sound, and ignorant men thought there was an earthquake. Malagis now approached the horse, which snapped and kicked at him viciously, but no sooner had he whispered the word "Bayard" than the creature pricked up its ears, and when he added, "Your master Hamen has need of you," it became gentle as a lamb, and allowed him to lead it to the upper world. "To Hamen!" cried Malagis, springing on its back, and the horse, neighing for joy, set off with the speed of the wind, over hill and dale, heath and morass. At the sound of the whinny, the Prince of Darkness awoke out of his sleep, and at once understood what had happened. Without loss of time, he flung himself astride of a storm cloud, and hurled a thunderbolt after the fugitives. But Malagis quietly said, "Abracadabra," at the same time holding up his crucifix. The thunderbolt fell harmless to the ground, but Lucifer was so much startled by the sight of the cross that he tumbled off his cloud, and, falling to the earth, broke his leg, and from that day forward he has had a limp in his gait. Meanwhile, Count Hamen was in sore distress. He was hunted like a wild beast from place to place. His men were all dead or else had deserted him. He was alone and desolate. One day, as he rode through a wood on a wretched broken-down hack, listening bitterly to the bay of the bloodhounds and the holloa of the hunters who pursued him, he saw a rider gallop into the clearing in front and exclaimed in joy, "Malagis, cousin Malagis, and Bayard, faithful Bayard! My misery is at an end now." Scarcely had he uttered these words when his pursuers were upon him. He sprang on Bayard's back, swung his sword, and faced his foes. He and his horse fought together, and but few of his antagonists lived to tell the tale of that day's work. Haman's evil fortune now changed to good. Friends came to his aid, and many castles and strongholds fell into his hands. The paladins of the great king avoided giving him battle, and the war seemed as if it might go on forever. The proud king longed for peace, and at last sent ambassadors to his disobedient vassal, offering to restore all his fiefs, and to pay him 4 times the weight in gold of the murdered Hug of Dordogne. Count Roland was sent at the head of the embassy. Haman received the messengers with all honour, especially his old friend Roland, but when he heard the terms offered by Karl, he said that the king's expiation for the murder must be 6 times the weight of his victim, and that he must further give his sister, Aya, to Haman in marriage. These terms were at first rejected by the king, but afterwards he consented, partly because the country needed peace, and partly, it was said, because the fair Princess Aya used her influence with her brother to that end. So peace was at length concluded. Count Hamen was restored to his former rank and dignity, and was married to the princess. After the wedding, the newly married couple retired to their castle of Pierrepont, where they lived for some time in love and unity. But Haman's was too active a disposition to be content with an idle life for long. He thirsted for glory, and to do great deeds, so he crossed over the Pyrenees into Spain, a country where the Christians and heathen Moors kept up a constant internecine war. For the first few years, Count Hamen used to return home from time to see his wife and children. But when the fortune of war led him further south, he stayed away altogether, and seemed to have forgotten his beautiful home and all that it contained. Reynolds and his brothers. Countess Heir mourned him as dead, and expended all her love on her 4 sons, whom she educated with the greatest care, and who rewarded her for her pains by growing up into wise and stately men. Reynolds, the youngest, and his father's image, was taller and stronger than his brothers, and a better swordsman than anyone about Pierrepont. He had inherited much of his father's quick temper, but to his mother he was always gentle and biddable. The 4 lads, Richard, Adelhart, Wighart, and Reynolds, had already shown their prowess in the field, when a messenger came to Pierrepont to say that Count Hamen was lying sick at an inn at the foot of the Pyrenean hills, and near a place where hot mineral springs were to be found. He wanted his wife to come and nurse him. Aya prepared to obey her husband without a moment's delay, and set out, accompanied by her sons. On her arrival at the inn, she hastened to embrace her husband and present her sons to him. The 3 elder lads embraced their sick father tenderly, but Reynolds hung back. "Who is this broken-down old man?" he cried. "It cannot be my father, for he is a great hero, and that man does not look much of a warrior. I wonder if he will try a bout with me." "Boy," said Hamen, standing up straight, "do you not know me for your father? Look at this ring which your mother gave me years ago, and at these scars which I gained in battle. And," continued the Countess, "does not my love for him bear witness that he is your father?" "Yes, mother," cried Reynolds, "I recognize him now." And so saying, he clasped his father in his arms and squeezed nearly all the breath out of his body. "Ah, this one is my son, and no mistake," said Hamen. "He was cut out of the same quarry." Aya and her sons were anxious to hear all that the Count had done and seen since they had met last, so Hamen told them all that had befallen him, and ended by saying that he brought home great wealth. This wealth he intended his 3 elder sons to divide equally amongst them, while his youngest son was to have his good sword Flamberg, and his horse Bayard, if he could manage to ride it. Reynolds did not in the least doubt his powers of riding anything, and begged his father, mother, and brothers to come and see him mount his new steed. They followed the lad into the stable. Reynolds went straight up to Bayard, and seizing the halter in one hand, was about to mount when the horse caught his coat between its teeth and threw him on the ground. The bold warrior, ashamed of his fall, sprang to his feet, and next moment was seated in the saddle. There was a fierce struggle for mastery, which ended in the victory of Reynolds. After a wild and dangerous ride, when Bayard once more stood in its stall, Hamen went up to the noble animal and said, "Bayard, this is my son, your future master." The horse seemed to understand, for it laid its head gently against Reynolds' breast, as though to acknowledge his mastery. Count Hamen was soon strong enough to return to Pierrepont with his family. Shortly after his arrival there, he heard that the king, who had lately been crowned emperor at Rome, intended to confer the honour of knighthood on his son and heir, Prince Ludwig, and on several squires of noble birth. Hamen and his sons at once determined to go to court on this occasion. A great tournament was held before the emperor knighted the young men, and each and all of the candidates showed himself worthy of the honour about to be bestowed on him, more especially Reynolds, whose prowess brought down endless acclamations. After the ceremony of knighting the young nobles was over, Ludwig was crowned king, and named his father's successor in the empire. The young king's first act was to distribute fiefs to the new-made knights, save and except to the brothers alone. These he passed over entirely. He did not even invite them to the feast, and to all appearance the day of general rejoicing was to be a fast day for them. Reynolds thought it too bad, so he walked into the royal kitchen and helped himself to all he needed for himself and his brothers. The reason of this extraordinary conduct on Ludwig's part was easy to guess. He was jealous of the superior strength and prowess Reynolds had displayed in the lists. Above all, he could not forget the fall he had met with at his hands. He confided his dislike of Reynolds to his favourite Ganelon, a fawning sycophant, and told him that he wanted to rid himself and the country of him whom he chose to regard as his enemy. Ganelon at once had a plan to propose. He said that Ludwig, who was famous for his skill in playing chess, should challenge Adelhart, one of the brothers, to play a game with him, each player to stake his head to the other. Reynolds would be sufficiently punished in Ganelon's eyes by the pain his brother's death would cause him. Ludwig agreed to the plan with alacrity. Adelhart, on receiving the challenge, declined to play on such terms, saying that if he won, he could not raise his hand against the life of his future liege lord. But Ludwig would not listen to any excuse, saying he would have him proclaimed a coward if he did not consent. So the young hero gave way, much against his will. A few minutes later, the two men were seated opposite each other before a chessboard, while 3 of the courtiers, who had been chosen umpires, stood beside the table and watched the players. 5 games were to be played. The chessmen on the one side were made of gold, those on the other of silver. Ludwig, who played with the golden chessmen, had the first move. The 5 stipulated games were played one after the other, and in each of the 5 Ludwig was checkmated. The umpires were silent. The king swept the pieces together impatiently, and when Adelhart said he had only played for the sake of his life and honour, that the head of his king was sacred in his eyes, Ludwig caught up the chessboard and flung it in his face with such force that the blood flowed from his mouth and nose and stained his garments. The hero instantly rose and withdrew. As he crossed the courtyard, his brother Reynolds hastened to meet him and asked what was the matter. On learning what had taken place, the younger brother was very angry. He gave orders that all should be got ready for their departure, and sent a servant to tell his father and brothers to come down to their horses. Then, turning to Adelhart, he said he would fetch him the prize he had won. Signing to his brother to follow him, he at once directed his steps to the throne room, where the emperor was seated with his knights and nobles about him. Ludwig and the umpires were there also. Reynolds advanced to the throne and told Karl the whole story, asking the umpires if it were not so. 2 of them were afraid and held their peace, but the 3rd boldly avowed the truth. Reynolds, upon this, drew his sword Flamberg, and with one stroke severed Ludwig's head from his body. Almost before the spectators could draw breath, the brothers had left the room. On reaching the courtyard, they at once mounted their horses and rode away, accompanied by Hamen and the rest of their party. They were pursued on the instant. The men-at-arms came up with them outside the town gates, and battle ensued. From the first there seemed to be very little chance for Count Hamen and his sons. They had but a few men-at-arms to support them, and the enemy's numbers increased every minute. Their men were at last all slain, and so were all their horses except Bayard, which bore bold Reynolds here, there, and everywhere with equal speed and safety. At length, seeing that further contest was useless, Reynolds called to his father and brothers to mount behind him on Bayard. The 3 brothers lost no time in obeying him, but Hamen was so hemmed in by the press of people that he could not move. Although bearing a 4-fold burden, Bayard galloped away as lightly and easily as if he had had nothing on his back. Hamen meantime yielded himself prisoner to Bishop Turpin, the bishop promising that his life should be spared. But the emperor refused to be bound by Turpin's promise, and ordered that Hamen should be publicly hung for the offence his son had committed. The bishop's entreaties were vain. It was not until Roland and the other paladins threatened to leave his service if he persisted in ordering Hamen's death that the emperor gave way, and set his prisoner free after making him swear to deliver his sons into his hands on the first opportunity. With the prospect of the gallows before his eyes, Hamen took the oath demanded of him. Meanwhile, the brothers journeyed rapidly through the broad lands of France. Nowhere could they find an abiding place, for they were outlaws, whose life was forfeited if they fell into the emperor's hands. At length they came to Safaret, a Moorish chieftain, with whom they made friends, and to whom they swore fealty. They remained with him 3 years, serving him well, but when at the expiration of that time they asked for the pay he had promised but never given, the Moor, who thought them unable to defend their rights, refused to listen to the request. So Reynolds, growing impatient, cut off his head. It was certainly an effectual way of ending the argument, but it necessitated immediate flight on the part of the brothers. This time they turned for protection to Ivo, Prince of Tarasconia, the mightiest opponent of Safaret. The prince received them with every mark of honour, and with their help gained many victories over his enemies. But when he heard of the imperial ban under which they lived, Ivo called his council together and asked what was to be done. Some of his advisers wanted him to get rid of the brothers as quickly as possible, while others said that it would be well to court the emperor's favour by delivering the outlaws into his hand. But the greater number were of opinion that the best thing to do would be to bind the heroes by some strong tie to the princely house. This last piece of advice was the one followed by Ivo, who gave Reynolds his only daughter Clarissa to wife, and appointed him and his brothers a residence by the sea. There a strong fortress called Montalban was built, which became the chief stronghold of the principality. On one occasion, the emperor's forces besieged it for a whole year, and then had to withdraw baffled. "Look," cried Richard, looking down from the battlements, "the imperial eagle flutters away into the forest with a broken wing. Up, Reynolds, and after it, that we may send it home like a plucked goose." "I have something else to do," answered his brother thoughtfully. 7 years have passed over our heads since we saw our good mother. The longing to see her again gnaws at my heart. I must go and visit her, were it to cost me my life." His brothers agreed to go with him, so they armed themselves cap à pie, drew long grey pilgrims' dresses over their armour, and set out for Castle Pierrepont. They got there safely, and were received with the greatest joy by their mother, who could not do enough to show them how happy their coming had made her. The chamberlain, who had taken them into the presence of the Countess Aya, soon discovered who they were, and determined to betray them. He went at once to his lord, Count Hamen, told him who the supposed pilgrims were, and reminded him of his oath to the emperor. Hamen was very angry, and felt inclined to slay the chamberlain there and then, but refrained. After taking counsel with himself, he made up his mind that the best thing he could do would be to take his sons prisoner and march them off to the emperor, giving them, however, an opportunity of slipping away before they reached Paris. So he called his men-at-arms to follow him and went to his wife's apartments. Aya, seeing them crossing the court, would have hidden her sons, but they refused to hide, and throwing off their pilgrims' robes, prepared to defend their lives to the last. Reynolds' great strength served him in good stead. He fought so furiously that the men-at-arms fell back. Hamen alone stood firm. Reynolds swung his sword, but his mother clung to him, entreating him to remember that it was his father who stood before him. Reynolds at once put up his sword, but disarmed his father and took him prisoner. "The man that would have delivered his own children to the executioner's axe shall go to his friend the emperor in a guise that befits his knightly character," said Reynolds. The men-at-arms stood so much in awe of the young man's prowess and strong arm that they promised implicit obedience. Reynolds, therefore, sent one of them to fetch an ass. When it was brought, he placed the count upon it, and bound him to the saddle. Then, calling a boy, he placed the reins in his hands, and bade him lead the prisoner to Paris. The count, however, had not so far to go after all, for meeting some of the imperial troops on the way, he was set at liberty, mounted on a horse, and taken back to Pierrepont. The brothers were enjoying themselves in their old home, when the emperor's troops arrived before the gates of the castle. Reynolds was alone with his mother when the order to surrender was given by the invaders. The young man snatched up his sword, but his mother silently pointed to the gates, which were already thrown open. She then dressed him hastily in his pilgrim's robes, and led him out of the castle by a secret door. Having done this, Aya returned to seek, and if it might be, save her other sons. But she found them prisoners and bound, and in the hands of their enemies. She wept and wrung her hands, for she knew that she was powerless to help them. Meantime, Reynolds was hastening back to Montalban as quickly as he could. He was determined to save his brothers, and knew that delay would be fatal. Arrived at home, he went straight to his stables, where Bayard whinnied with joy to see him. After eating a few mouthfuls of food hastily, he mounted his gallant steed, and started for Paris, as swiftly as if his horse had had wings. He halted in a thick wood near the town, dismounted, and while his horse grazed beside him, threw himself down at the foot of a great tree and began to consider what would be his best plan of operation. Overmastered by fatigue, he presently fell asleep, and dreamt that a necromancer was stealing his horse. When he awoke, he looked about him anxiously and called "Bayard," but in vain. He called louder and louder. No answer was returned. He looked carefully for marks of his horse's feet, but found none. At the edge of the wood he met a pilgrim, who spoke to him humbly. After some conversation, the pilgrim pushed back his hood and looked at Reynolds with a smile, and the young man recognized his cousin Malagis. The necromancer then promised to restore the brothers and Bayard safe and sound. He took some yellow powder out of a box and sprinkled it over himself and Reynolds, at the same time muttering his abracadabra, and in a moment they were changed into the likeness of crippled beggars. Together they limped into Paris. A crowd of richly dressed lords and ladies were crossing the bridge over the Seine, which at the time connected the island city with the mainland. The emperor was there also, and beside him was the famous hero Roland, to whom he had promised the horse Bayard, if he would fight and conquer the sons of Hamen. The horse was led by several grooms. All at once it stopped short, whinnied, jerked the reins out of the groom's hands, and trotted up to the two beggars who were watching the procession.
"Bayard is strangely constituted," cried Count Roland. "The beast seems actually to like poor folk better than noble knights."
"Bayard? Is this Bayard?" asked one of the beggars. "Oh, noble gentleman, if this be Bayard, pray permit my poor comrade to mount him. A holy man told us that if he did so, he would at once be cured, and, as you see, he is a lamester."
"Well, cousin Roland," said the emperor, "help the poor fellow up, that we may see a miracle for once in our lives. I only hope it will be a miracle, that the miserable wretch's arms and legs may not be broken."
Roland signed to his servants, who with much difficulty hoisted the ragged lamester into the saddle. They had to do it 3 times before he was safely settled. No sooner was he firmly seated than he drew himself up proudly, touched Bayard with the heel of one of his wooden shoes, and galloped away so fast that no one could overtake him. Malagis pretended to be much frightened lest his comrade should meet with some injury from the runaway horse. At midnight, a little man might have been seen creeping along the streets of Paris, dressed in a grey coat. He kept continually murmuring, "Ista, sista, pista, abracadabra," and dark clouds rose and covered the sky, making the moon and stars grow dim. He at last reached a tall and gloomy-looking house, before which a guard was set, but the watchmen had bent their heads and fallen asleep at his approach. The strong oak doors opened when he touched them with the point of his staff. He entered and went straight to an underground dungeon, where 3 men were chained to the wall. He muttered some mysterious words, and the chains fell from off them. "Rise, brothers," he said. "Your cousin Malagis is here. He has come to save you." So they rose and followed him. Before leaving Paris, the necromancer went to the sleeping emperor and asked him for the loan of his crown and sword. Karl immediately gave them to him. The emperor's feelings next morning may be more readily imagined than described. When he heard of the events that had taken place during the night, he longed more than ever to have his revenge on the sons of Hamen, but could not see how to accomplish his desire. Cunning Ganelon then said that he was sure that Ivo had his price, and might be induced to sell the brothers to the emperor. Karl tried the plan, and won Ivo to his side on paying him a ton's weight of gold. This done, the faithless traitor went to Montalban, and said that he brought good news from Paris. He had persuaded the emperor to let bygones be bygones, and all would now be well if the 4 brothers would only go to Volcano, unarmed, and in the garb of penitents, and there beg forgiveness. The emperor had promised, Ivo said, to grant them a full pardon, and to restore them to their ancient dignities. When the brothers were about to start for Volcano, Clarissa entreated them to beware lest the message were a treacherous one, adding that she knew her father would sell his own child for gold. Reynolds sternly told her that she was an unnatural daughter, and bade her hold her peace. He then rode on, but Adelhart remained behind for a moment, and hid 4 swords, which his sister-in-law handed him, under the skirts of his penitent's robe. As the brothers were riding on their asses up the steep and narrow path that led to Volcano, they were set upon by an armed band of warriors. Adelhart divided the swords with which Clarissa had provided him, and they defended themselves so well that the Count of Shalong, fearful of losing more men, determined to draw a cordon round the place where the brothers had taken their stand, and starve them out. The 4 weary men sat down to rest, They looked anxiously all round to see whether help would not come. The hot day was over, and evening coming on apace, when all at once they saw a well-known banner on the opposite hill. It was waved by a horseman who was galloping towards them, accompanied by a small band of armed men. Reynolds immediately recognized his Bayard and his cousin, the necromancer. The battle at once began in the plain below. Before it had lasted long, Bayard had caught sight of its master. With a loud neigh of pleasure, the noble horse broke through the enemy's ranks and galloped up to Reynolds. Malagis dismounted, threw his cousin the reins, and at the same time handed him his sword Flamberg, which Clarissa had sent. Reynolds flung himself into the saddle and rode down to the place of combat, followed by his brothers, who had in the meantime caught some of the riderless chargers that were flying from the field. The brothers gained a glorious victory, and the Count of Shalong only succeeded in saving the remnants of his forces by retreating under cover of the darkness.
"Who told the magician? Who is the traitor?" cried the Emperor when he heard what had happened.
After many conjectures had been hazarded, everyone came to the conclusion that none other than Ivo had betrayed the true state of matters to Malagis, and one of the courtiers added that the Prince of Tarasconia had taken refuge in the monastery of Beaurepart, upon which the Emperor said grimly that even the walls of the sanctuary should not protect him from his vengeance, and immediately dispatched Roland to capture Ivo and see him hanged. When Reynolds first returned to Montalban, it was his firm intention to punish his father-in-law's treachery with death, but Clarissa's entreaties prevailed, and he promised to spare him. It was for fear of his vengeance that Ivo had taken refuge in the monastery. He never thought of the Emperor turning against him. Reynolds did not hide his satisfaction when he learnt that Karl had sent to take Ivo out of the monastery, that he might hang him at Mount Volcano. But Clarissa was much troubled in spirit when her husband told her the news. "Ah, my baby," she said, bending over her child, "perhaps you will grow up to be a hero like your father, and then people will point at you and say, 'Yes, he is very brave and a true hero, but still he is the grandson of a man who died on the gallows,' and then you will creep away from the assembly of noblemen and try to hide your shame in the wilderness." Reynolds sat for some minutes in thoughtful silence. Then, springing to his feet, he kissed his wife and said, "You are as wise and good as one of God's angels. The traitor shall be saved." He hastened to the stable, mounted his horse, and galloped away to the forest of Mount Volcano. There he found Ivo standing at the gallows with the cord round his neck. Reynolds knocked down one of the executioners, cut the cord round Ivo's neck, exclaiming, "Be off, you rascal, lest you be hanged after all," and then beat back the other executioner, who would have recaptured the Prince of Tarasconia. Count Roland now came to the rescue, but was soon forced to measure his length upon the ground, and Reynolds rode away, saying, "It was your horse's fault, good cousin, not yours." Several of the paladins, who had witnessed the short combat between the heroes, began to make jesting remarks about what had occurred. Roland had never been unhorsed before, except once or twice by Olivier, and he took the matter grievously to heart. He rode away in silence, not to Paris, but in the direction of Montalban, that he might seek vengeance for his overthrow. As he was riding through a wood, he met a man with a crossbow who was shooting a deer, and at once recognized him to be Richard, Reynolds' brother. He took him prisoner, and in spite of Richard's remonstrances and his reminders of their relationship, took him to Paris and delivered him to the Emperor. Karl was delighted at the lucky chance, at once condemned Richard to be hung at Mount Volcano, and asked which of his paladins would undertake the task of seeing the sentence carried out. They all refused, saying that hanging was not a seemly death for a knight to die. At length Riep, a new-made knight, offered his services to the Emperor. A pious pilgrim, who was present at the discussion, begged that execution might be delayed until he had had time to pray for the weal of the poor sinner at St. Denis. But instead of going to St. Denis, the holy man went to Montalban and told Reynolds all that had happened, bidding him make haste if he would arrive at Mount Volcano in time to save Richard's life. Having said this, Malagis, for the pilgrim was none other than he, went to the kitchen to ask for some food, for he was tired and hungry after his long and arduous journey on foot. Reynolds, Adelhart, Wichart, and their men soon reached the gallows at Mount Volcano. There was no one there, so they stretched themselves out on the grass and fell asleep. When Riep came with his prisoner, They were still asleep, but Bayard, hearing them, awoke his master with a kick. In another moment the brothers had fallen upon the imperial troops, whom they soon put to flight. They then set Richard free and hung Riepe with the same rope he had brought for his prisoner. The emperor, finding that all his former attempts to avenge his son's death had been in vain, determined on a new plan of action. He called out a large army and marched to lay siege to Montalban. The fortress was strictly invested. The besieged ventured on making an occasional sally on the enemy without the walls, for the purpose of getting provisions, etc. Much blood was shed on either side, but nothing decisive took place. The siege went on for years, and neither party gave way. At length the garrison of Montalban began to feel the want of provisions, and Reynolds made up his mind to a desperate step. He broke through the besiegers' camp, and carried off a number of provision wagons. Malagis had rendered such action possible by slipping out of the fortress unnoticed and sprinkling some of his sleeping powder over part of the camp. As he was about to scatter another pinch, he was seized by the collar, and looking round saw that it was strong Olivier, one of the 12 paladins, who was dragging him away. The rough attack had knocked the powder out of the necromancer's hand, and it had fallen on the ground. Instead of laying his hand on his sword, the little man caught hold of the bag of hellebore snuff he had hidden within his garment, and threw a pinch into Olivier's face. The hero sneezed, and still he sneezed, but the more convulsively he sneezed, the tighter he clutched his prisoner, whom he at length dragged into the emperor's presence. "Achoo, your highness," he said, and sneezed. I bring you achoo, the wicked achoo, necromancer achoo, do with him achoo, as you will." Here such an agony of sneezing came upon poor Olivier that he could say no more. The emperor thanked and pitied the worthy paladin, and ordered that the magician should be bound and guarded to Mount Volcano, where he was to be hanged. "Sire," whimpered Malagis, "pray let me live this one more night, and let me have a good supper, for I have not tasted food for the last 24 hours. Meanwhile the paladins and many other knights had entered the royal tent. They one and all joined their entreaties to those of the poor little man. Seeing that the emperor seemed inclined to yield, Malagis said in a grave and solemn tone, "Your Majesty, I swear on my honour that I will not go away from here without your own consent, nor will I go unless you bear me company." Karl then promised to let him have the 24 hours' grace, and several of the knights offered their services as guards. The lords sat down to supper, and devoted their whole attention to the good food and wine that was set before them, while Malagis, curled up in a corner close at hand, appeared to do the same. When supper was over, the necromancer was taken to the place that was to serve him as prison, and the noble knights, who had undertaken to keep watch and ward, took up their places for the night. At midnight, Malagis had recourse to his knowledge of the black art. He made a deep magic sleep fall upon the camp, and all within its bounds save and except himself. Then, stepping softly, he made his way to the emperor's bedside, and dropped a few drops of some medicament into Karl's mouth, which ensured his sleep lasting for 12 good hours, after which he lifted him up, and carried him pickaback to the castle. The great gate was flung open at the sound of his well-known voice, and great was the astonishment of Reynolds when he saw what burden he carried on his shoulders. "Here is the pledge of peace," said Malagis. "It has cost me much hard work to bring it here. See that my labour bears fruit." The emperor was carried to the best guest room the castle contained, and the Lady Clarissa did all that lay in her power for the comfort of the great man. Karl did not wake till noon. At first he thought he must be dreaming when he saw Reynolds, Malagis, and strange servants about him. The truth dawned upon him gradually, and a bitter truth it was. Hunger forced him to accept the food Clarissa brought, though he would much rather not have eaten it. Reynolds tried by every means in his power to induce the emperor to give up his plans of vengeance and make peace with him, but his efforts were vain. Then it occurred to him that a proud, haughty nature that could not be bent by harshness was often softened by kindness. He set Kaiser Karl at liberty, and the emperor went away from Montalban without a word or sign that betokened reconciliation. When Reynolds re-entered the castle, he found his cousin Malagis burning boxes, bags, and all kinds of written papers. Much surprised, he asked what he was doing, and Malagis replied, "I am burning all that the noble art of necromancy has taught me. I shall need these things no more, for my services are useless to such a madman as you. I am now going away into the wilderness to join the holy penitents. There I shall repent with them in sackcloth and ashes." He was as good as his word, for he took his departure soon afterwards, never to return. When the emperor went back to his camp, he related all his adventures. The paladins, one and all, entreated him to make peace with the heroic brothers, but he refused, saying that his murdered son's blood still cried aloud for vengeance. So the castle still remained beleaguered, and fortune seemed to have deserted the garrison with the departure of the little necromancer. The store of provisions grew less every day. Hunger stared the brave men in the face. Reynolds, after much consideration, thought of a way of escape, and made all needful preparations. One evening, when darkness had begun to set in, he took leave of his weeping wife, and accompanied by his brothers and a small band of determined men, made his way cautiously and silently through the enemy's lines, and set out for a strong castle in the forest of Ardennes. Next morning the emperor was told what had happened, and he did what Reynolds had expected. He at once ordered the siege of Montalban to be raised, and started in pursuit of the fugitives. He soon came up with them, but they defended themselves so well, and took such wise measures to ensure their safety, that they succeeded in reaching the stronghold for which they were bound. Death of Bayard and Reynolds. The heroes fought as bravely as ever in defence of their new place of refuge, emboldened by the knowledge that their dear ones at Montalban were now free. But however courageous a man may be, hunger and disease are foes under whose attacks it is impossible to hold out forever. In the time of their sorest distress, Aya went to the imperial camp and entreated her brother to have mercy on her children. The emperor refused to listen to her, and harshly bade her go out of his presence. But she returned again and again to the charge, and at last Karl said, "Very well, listen to my offer, and let Reynolds accept it if he will. The horse Bayard that Malagis brought up out of hell has done me more harm than any other creature, excepting Reynolds himself. Now I will pardon your 4 sons, and restore their fiefs, if Reynolds will give the brute to me to be killed as I think best. I give you my word as an emperor that I will accept Bayard's life in expiation of my son's death." When Aya returned to the castle and showed the parchment on which she had had the terms of the proposed treaty written out in full, Reynolds refused to give up his dearest and most faithful friend. "Think of your wife, your children, and your brothers. The gallows at Mount Volcano are prepared. An inscription will be placed there that will be read by future generations. He gave them all up to die a shameful death for the sake of a dumb animal." "Mother," cried the hero, and rushing up to Bayard, he fed his faithful friend with a last piece of bread, and bursting into tears, threw his arms around its slender neck. The horse whinnied softly, and laid its head trustingly on his shoulder. "I cannot do it, mother, I cannot do it," cried Reynolds. "Bayard and I must live and die together." "Very well, my son," she said, "but remember that when all my children and grandchildren are hanging on the gallows, your mother's heart will break." "Mother," he answered in a strange, hollow voice, "have your will. You have conquered, but I shall not survive it." He then signed the treaty, and Aya returned with it to the imperial camp. A crowd was assembled on the bridge in Paris, for the news had gone abroad that the famous Bayard was to be drowned. Kaiser Karl was there also with his paladins. The noble horse was led to the middle of the bridge, with iron weights fastened to its feet, and at a signal was suddenly pushed over the edge, and fell with a splash into the Seine. In spite of the weights upon his legs, it rose to the surface once, twice, thrice. "That horse is the devil incarnate," cried the emperor furiously. "Ha! Count Reynolds, beware, its eyes are fixed on you. If you are keeping it alive by any enchantment, it will be the worse for you. I will tear up the treaty." With a low cry of terror, Aya flung her arms around her son, drawing down his head so that he did not see how Bayard rose a 4th time, and then, not seeing his master's face, sank to rise no more. The hero felt that all happiness had gone with Bayard. He thrust his mother aside, flung at the emperor's feet the letters patent entitling him to his fiefs, and breaking his sword Flamberg, threw it into the Seine, muttering, "Lie there with my Bayard, and may God forget to be gracious to me if I ever mount a horse or draw a sword again." Then he turned and fled into the depths of the wild forest, until at last he sank exhausted on the ground. There he remained for 2 days and a night, overwhelmed and mad with misery. After that he went home to Montalban. Meeting a pilgrim on the way, he gave him his golden spurs and all his ready money for his grey robes and felt hat. Lady Clarissa wept when she heard the end of the noble horse, for she had loved Bayard, but she wept still more bitterly when Reynolds took leave of her for ever. "Who will teach our sons," she cried, "to be true knights and noble men, if you go and leave them thus?" "Our cousin, Count Roland, will do so," he answered, "and you will do your part, dear wife." He kissed the tears from her eyes and continued, "Accept no fief from Kaiser Karl. Go with our children to our own lands on the other side of the mountains. The tyrant has no power there, for the lands are your own. As for me, I am about to start on a pilgrimage to the grave of our Lord to see whether I may find forgiveness. You will never see me again." Saying this, he tore himself away and set out at once upon his long and toilsome journey. Reynolds went to the Holy Land, where he found a fierce war raging between the Christians and infidels. He was true to his vow. He neither mounted a horse nor wielded a sword, but still he fought like a hero with an enormous club and helped in the taking of Jerusalem. After he had prayed at the Holy Sepulchre, he returned to his native land, but not to his wife and children, nor yet to his brothers, for he had died to all earthly ties and joys. He went to Cologne, where the cathedral was being built. There he lived a hard, ascetic life, and worked as a labourer at the building. He did not even stop working during the hour of rest in the middle of the day, although his wages were only a penny a day. This conduct aroused the anger of the stonemasons, so they rose in a body, killed him, and threw his body into the Rhine. But the river would not keep it. The corpse floated on the surface of the water and was drawn to land by some pious souls. And now several miracles were wrought upon those who touched his body, which showed that he had been a holy man. The emperor, hearing of the wonders that had taken place, had the murderers tried and executed, and sent orders that the body of the saint should be brought to Aix-la-Chapelle, Aachen, or to Paris. No sooner was the body laid upon the cart which was to convey it, than the vehicle moved of its own accord, and rolled on, no matter how bad the roads, till it arrived at Dortmund in Westphalia, where it stopped, that being the spot the saint had evidently chosen as his last resting place. The Rinaldi church at Dortmund was built in his honour. The legend gives the exact date of the miracle, 7th of January, 811.